Hello, and welcome to the Giants Next Door, where we speak with the leaders shaping Australia's future through deeper engagement with Asia. Here we talk with some of the country's key business figures about their relationship with Asia and hearing their insights and reflections on what it takes to lead, build and succeed in the region. My guest today is Sanjeev Gandhi, Managing Director and CEO of Orica. Sanjeev has spent more than 26 years working across Asia, from India and Japan to Singapore and Hong Kong, leading teams in complex, high-stakes industries and navigating the cultural and commercial diversity of the region. Before moving to Australia in 2020, he built a career at the intersection of global markets and local realities, shaping strategies that bridge national priorities with international opportunity. Today, he brings that perspective to Orica's global operations and to broader conversations about Australia's place in Asia, offering a rare vantage point of how corporate leadership can deepen our regional engagement. Sanjeev, welcome to the Giants Next Door.
Hey Lee, it's good to be with you.
Yeah, great to see you as well. Sanjeev, I'm really keen to start with those early years. You grew up in India. You started in what went on to be a very impressive 26-year career with BASF. I'm interested to draw out starting in their Mumbai office, working across Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore. It must have been just absolutely huge experiences. What were the moments in those early days that really shifted how you thought about leadership and particularly working across different cultures?
Yeah, I tell you, it was a bit of a cultural journey, wasn't it? Before leaving India, never had the chance to travel overseas, which in those days, coming from a middle-class family, you couldn't afford airfares to go outside of India. So the only time you got onto a plane as a child or as a student was when you traveled domestically, if at all. So the first journey we made leaving the country was out to Germany, of all places, and after that to Japan. So places that couldn't be more culturally different to my upbringing in a middle-class family coming out of India. So it was I would say, pretty challenging and exciting journey, and there was a lot of obviously lessons that we had to learn on the way, and some hard knocks and a few successes on the way. So it's been interesting, and the extreme diversity of cultures into a European German culture, into a Japanese culture, and then coming into Southeast Asia and into China, and trying to adapt all the time. It's been quite a journey, honestly. But not just for myself, but also for my family. And I think we were better off for that journey and that experience, and we are blessed that we had the opportunity of working in all of these different diverse parts of the world, and hopefully also to contribute a little bit from our side to where we were.
As you're speaking, the word resilience came to mind. I'm sure as you work through those different cultures, and those are some fairly different cultures. So to sort of uplift and move across to a different environment, and let alone be, productive at work, but all of the settling and transitions and these types of aspects. I mean, that must have, you must have built out that resilience gene that was sitting within you.
I tell you, look, I mean, the two things which stand out was adaptability and resilience. So you obviously need to have a bit of competence and understand what you're doing and where you can contribute. But without adaptability and resilience, you cannot succeed as a leader in any kind of business in any part of the world, but especially so in Asia, because Asia is not one region, as you know so well. You had your own experiences in Asia, and you know how challenging it can be. Cultures are different, languages different, histories are different, and the region has had some hard knocks from history, some positive, some very negative. And all of that reflects in the way you do business as a leader, as part of the business community. And it can't be more diverse than how different Japan is to Korea, and Korea is to Taiwan and China, and then Southeast Asia, and then obviously South Asia and India. They are all so very different, and there is no common thread, right? There's no EU or there's no United States of Asia. There's no common language. There's no common culture as such. So how does it all link together? And, I've had the privilege of working as a regional manager sitting in Tokyo and taking care of 18 countries across Asia. right? So first of all, an Indian sitting in Japan, that's already a challenge. And then sitting in Tokyo and trying to manage all these different countries with their own interests and cultural backgrounds and diversity was some kind of quite an amazing experience, I have to say.
Yeah. Was there a moment where you thought of yourself, having built up that adaptability competency, and after a couple of transitions, that you started to think of yourself as a global citizen, that suddenly your ability to transition cultures, or you saw the map of the world and thought, okay, I know I've successfully navigated and succeeded in one environment, and now I've built this out as a skill that I can use in others. Did you ever have that moment of saying, hey, I'm a global citizen?
Look, every move, and we have had several, obviously. Every move has its own challenges and excitement and opportunities, but it gets easier. That's your experience, right? That's what you build, the competence. Your family gets used to the fact that we are working nomads with no roots, right? And then that becomes kind of a way of life. And it's a very unusual way of life, because that's not something most people can claim to have done. Moved around, 13, 14 times, several times in different parts of the world. But yeah, it got better. But the fun part was always in business to get acceptance, right? And every country and every culture has their own way of doing business and operating, even within the same organization that I worked for. As an example, I felt really accepted in Japan when my colleagues started inviting me for the evening drinks at the bars, at the izakaya, because that was a culture at that point of time. I'm sure there's a bit of that today too. But every evening, the colleagues used to get together and then go out for a drink and maybe a second drink and then head back home. And that was kind of a routine. And the first 3 or 4 months or 6 months, they were trying to gauge me, this strange gaijin or Indian or whatever. And then, when they started to accept me, I started getting invited. And that's when I felt, I think I've arrived. I've been accepted by the organization. I've been accepted by my colleagues. I was able to order a couple of beers in Japanese, and all of that made life a bit easier. But yeah, there is always a time when you realize that now that you've established a presence and you're starting to make positive impacts, you start to get accepted. And I think acceptance and adaptability is all about giving and taking, right? So what I learned from the culture and the organization, and what I'm able to contribute from my own experience and background, once that balances out, that's when you start to add real value, both sides, to yourself, because you're learning all the time, and obviously your experience to the business in that particular structure and organization. So yeah, there is always a time when you realize that, yeah, it's getting a bit easier and it's now a lot more fun. Yeah, the familiarity and the experience that comes with it.
And you've touched on those offers of hospitality, which is something of a golden rule. If an offer of hospitality is extended, you should readily accept it. So, in terms of what you've alluded to there, it took a little bit of a while for it to come, though. But as soon as it came, you knew that this was a moment. It crystallized something for you to accept those offers. And, it'd be a bit of a misstep to decline an offer of hospitality and treat it as something casual, other than, the deep symbolic moment that it is to say, please enjoy this food, have this drink, these types of things.
Absolutely. It means a lot. And you might miss it, as you said, you might make a mistake. And it's different. And I'll give you an interesting example. I mean, when I moved the second time to Germany, I had an Asian boss in Germany who came from Korea, of all places. Right? So, the cultures can't be more diverse. And so I was having a conversation with him and said, so how are you feeling, in your new role after 6 months? And he was in a senior position. So he was the country head of Korea, and then he moved to a senior position at the headquarters in Germany. And he said, look, I'm enjoying it and it's a lot of fun and I'm learning a lot, but I have one problem. And I said, tell me, because I've been in Germany before. Maybe I can give you, even though I'm junior too, I might be able to give you some advice. He said, in Korea, when I asked my team to join me for a dinner, it was a day before. And they all showed up without exception, right? In Germany, I have to give them 6 months of notice because they have to plan their family life and all of that. And then I hope that at least half of them will show up. So they don't feel obligated to show up in Germany, because for them, work and life is as important and the balance is important. And an after evening or after work event is not that critical for them, even if the boss invites you. So with great difficulty, I got maybe 30 or 40% of my team to show up, and I had to do multiple of such events, and with long planning schedules till I could get them all in and have those casual conversations outside of the office. In Korea, it took 1 day. So you see how different the cultures are and how organizations and people play. Very different.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move to your experience in Australia. You built a career across Asia before stepping into this senior role with Orica as CEO. I'm curious, how was your perspective on how Asia is viewed from an Australian lens changed since making that shift here?
Yeah, well, look, given our proximity, but we are not that close to Asia, right? We're part of Asia Pacific. We are not really out of Asia, but we are the closest mature economy to the Asian region. We have a very important role to play, and it's been a historical role of whether supplying Asia their energy needs or their need for resources, and Australia has been very successful doing this. But the one thing I have learned doing business in Asia now for nearly 30 plus years, 35 years, is that you cannot trade your way to success in Asia, right? Because that is a very opportunistic way of doing business. If you are committed to a region or a market, you invest in the market. Yeah. And you put capital into the market, you build your infrastructure in the market, you build your manufacturing resources, if that's the industry you are in that market, you hire a local team, and then you adapt your product offering, whether it comes from Australia or from your local manufacturing sites for that particular market, because the market is very different. We talked about diversity in culture. It's also diversity in terms of the needs of what people need. As a great example, here in Australia, you love to tan yourself, right? So a tanned skin is a sign of good health. In Asia, and you know this, people hide from the sun with heavy doses of sunscreen, and they use umbrellas because they would not prefer their skin to be tan. And if you're in the cosmetic business, for example, if you do not understand this basic fact, right, you will never succeed. So the products that work in Australia need not necessarily work in Asia. So you need to adapt, and you need to stop with this mentality of I can produce in Australia and trade in Asia, because the Asian market has choices. And a lot of other global economies like the American economy, the European big manufacturers, and even Asian manufacturers have transplanted their operations into the domestic markets where they'd like to do business, and they've been very successful. The Japanese, for example, came into India 35 years back with the first cars and the first electronics, and today they are very well established. The Koreans did the same. And China is again a great example where American companies, European companies invested. I started an investment program 25 years back in China, invested more than 10 billion euros. And then my former company became one of the biggest chemical manufacturers in China. So it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of courage, but you can't trade your way to success in the Asian markets. You need to be there on the ground physically.
So to flip that question or that insight, do you think Australian businesses are still missing a trick in Asia? I mean, some of the things that you've spoken about there are, factually stated and understood. Well, at least they're written down and people hear them, but do they really adopt them? Do Australian businesses still need to go further in this regard?
I think they need to. Look, we've done very, very well with China. The next big opportunity is India, clearly, but also Southeast Asia. And just take the example of Orica, right? We are active now in eight or nine markets in Asia. We've got manufacturing in Indonesia. We are the largest producer of our products and services in Indonesia. We are number one in the Philippines. We are number two in India. We've got a manufacturing presence and people on the ground in China. We are number one in Malaysia. We are growing our business in Laos and Singapore. So, we've got a manufacturing presence. We've got several thousand people operating across 8 to 10 different markets in Asia, and we are successful. We are the most successful in our industry in the Asian markets, and there's a reason for that. We've had a long history of investing in those domestic markets, in local talent, building relationships with our domestic customers, the resource industry, the civil industry, and we are now number one in that region. So it has taken us 30 to 40 years to build our position there, but we started early. So my predecessors obviously had the vision to invest in here. American company, Australian companies need to do more. So there's this bit of risk averseness, the fear of the unknown, the fear of I'm totally exposed to China, but am I ready now to put capital and money on the ground in India? Not yet. Maybe I need a bit more time to think about it. We miss an opportunity by being too slow here, because others are moving fast. Other economies are moving fast. Tariffs are forcing supply chains to change as we speak. Geopolitics is forcing us to do that. So we need to speeden up, in my view. You're missing a trick.
So what's your advice for Australian businesses who want to get started? They see some of the big Aussie businesses going out. That may give them confidence in the marketplace. At the same time, not every business is a big business. We've got a huge number of small and medium enterprises. What's your advice in terms of businesses either making their first foray into Asian markets or, to your point, maybe they've been exporting to somewhere like China, but now they're thinking of, well, what's next?
Look, Asia is a massive region. So the first advice I would give is don't spread yourselves too thin. Right? Every organization, big or small, has limited resources. You can't be everywhere at the same time. Select the markets where you can set yourself up for success. Try and understand the market by being on the ground, talking to your customers, talking to potential partners. Find a good partner. Use the support of organizations like Asia Link, like what Austrade does, DFAT does. We've got a lot of knowledge. There's no shortage of knowledge and connections and links. Talk to folks like Orica who have been doing this for a long time. We are happy to provide our support. Get your organization Asia ready, something that Asia Lung and you really have been doing very well. And then take those first baby steps into the market with a partner, with the support of local authorities and the Australian trade network that we have there, and start scaling your business up. Right? And then you'll start to learn and you'll make mistakes. Right? And there'll be losses and there'll be issues and problems. But you build credibility, you get experience, you get more confident, you start to develop a local talent pool who understands what you're doing, and then you grow your way to success. So there's no quick win. The other way to do that, which is a bit more risky, is obviously do an acquisition, buy an established domestic company in the market you want to grow into, and then you've got your base load there, and then you grow from there. So there are several ways of doing it. Do it as a joint venture, do it with a partner, do it through distribution initially, then back integrate into manufacturing, do an acquisition. We've done all of them. So we've got experience doing all of them, and you get success. Sometimes you do fail sometimes, but the risk reward has to be balanced out, and the rewards are huge if you're successful in Asia.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And you introduced risk reward, that proposition. And I do note there's a level of conservatism, the resources that are involved in exploring, even the decision to export or do business overseas. I mean, it's a huge outlay of not just, financially, but in terms of resources and the mental capacity to be covering so many issues. It just feels like, even geopolitics is coming to us here at home in Australia. So overcoming that conservatism might be a theme, and implementing or having the fortitude to say, look, we really need to go out to a new market or explore different markets is something to really think through for businesses, because these are choices. Businesses are just faced with so many challenges and choices, as I say, domestic, let alone international. But once you get overseas, and then you've got to work out, where do you stay true to who you are, as in terms of, well, this is what makes our product or our ways of working distinct, and this is the value we have, versus then adapting them to local cultures and contexts. How do you work out striking that balance? Because to me, that's the one. If you go too far, you compromise who you are. If you don't go far enough, you're seen as not being adaptable, and you get critiqued all over the shop.
Well, I'd start by saying that Australian businesses are privileged because the Made in Australia brand is of very high repute in Asia. Right? And any Australian product, whether it's a food product, whether it's a wine, it's pharmaceuticals, it's technology, it's what Orica makes in Australia, for example, is always considered premium. So the Made in Australia brand has a lot of inherent value, like the Made in Germany brand. I had similar conversations with my former colleagues in Germany to say, you're not exploiting the Made in Germany brand. In Asia, it is perceived to be high standards, high quality, and Asian customers are willing to pay a premium. It's not very different for Australian brands. So Australia as a country has this reputation of high quality, high standards, first world manufacturing practices, environmentally sustainable. So we come with that advantage. But you cannot just transplant an Australian product or solution or service into an Asian market. That's where the adaptability comes. So as you said, stay true to your roots, leverage the Made in Australia brand or from Australia brand, and then start to find your niches within the markets. Now, you don't want to be competing in most cases with the low value products because you've got all different kinds of standards in the Asian markets. They're not all Japan or Korea. So you've got emerging Asia, you've got developed Asia. So you need to find your little niche there and then try to find a way where you differentiate and leverage the Made in Australia brand or Made from Australia brand and then try to adapt your products and services to the Australian market. So I can tell you my example. When I go to India, which is my birthplace, and I go for holiday, I always send a short WhatsApp to all my friends to say, what do you need from Australia? And I tell you, they'll say, get me some fantastic Shiraz bottles of wines. We'd love that. Get me the Aussie honey. We'd love that. Anything to do with sports. We'd love that. So I have a friend who's into cycling, and he's always asking me to buy parts for his bicycle from Australia and take them to India. Right? Because he says there's just better quality, and I'm happy to pay for it. So that premium effect that you have, that halo you have around made in Australia, leverage that to the fullest. But then you need to still cater to the domestic needs of your Asian market.
Yeah, it can be quite beguiling or a bit of a misstep for businesses to look at a large populous country, but then also look at the GDP and just say, well, average GDP is this amount, so therefore all consumers look like this. I mean, there's markets within markets in Asia. So there are many Asias. And even within distinct countries, whether it's regions or a class of consumer or business that might be looking at what you're offering, your goods, your services. So
Absolutely.
I just want to extend out that piece about Australian strengths and local, so localization, adaptation, these types of things. Where do you think, from your perspective, Australian businesses are getting it right, and where are we still missing the mark? Where could we go further?
I mean, look, it's different from country to country. If you look at Japan and I'll give you two examples. You look at Japan as an example. Japan expects Australia to be a supplier of energy, right? That's been the traditional relationship. But Japan is transitioning itself into more renewable energy. Can Australia play a role, right? Developing renewable energy sources, developing green hydrogen, green ammonia, sending it to Japan so that they're able to produce more renewable power, sustainable power. So we have a role to play. So it's the same customer base, but we're transitioning from old style of economy to the future. Right? So that's the opportunity. In China, Australia is already known. We are a fantastic brand in China. We are exporting a lot of the feedstocks that they use to make finished products. So can our manufacturing organizations now go in and enter into those value chains? Battery materials as an example. Anything to do with renewables and sustainability. Sustainable farming, where we are so good at it. Right? So there's so much opportunity. Pharmaceuticals. We've got so much of know-how and talent and technology here. So you're already in China. Can we now develop our base there and get more of the capture more of the pie, of the share of the wallet? And then India is an open market. There are very few. There are some few good success stories in India, but there is so much potential in India. So be brave, enter India. Initially, it's a big shock, and after that, you see the massive potential of this market, right? And big middle class, aspirational. They've got the spending power now to buy the best brands in the world. And how can Australian businesses exploit this?
So let's bring that down to individual experiences you've had or lessons learned for yourself. I mean, working across such a wide array of cultures and going into new markets. Was there a particular instance for you where you've found a project or initiative or an entry going a certain way, and then it's been through understanding local culture or relationships or some aspect that's really helped you to navigate a challenge in an Asian context?
Oh, I don't think we have enough time to talk about all of my experiences, having spent such an extended amount of time in Asia. But look, there have been fantastic success stories. China was one, right? 20 years back, China started to open up to foreign investment. Right, and then I was based out of Hong Kong, and then I was invited by the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC as it's known in China. And they said, you represent the biggest chemical company in the world. Can you come bring your technology to China? Can you manufacture for the Chinese market? And we will support and help you. So they made it quite clear that future success of my former organization was absolutely dependent on us investing in China and manufacturing in China for the Chinese market. And that was very, very, very successful. So we managed to convince our board at that point of time, and we invested big capital. And today it is still one of the biggest Western players in that industry in China, and very, very successful and profitable. India, on the other hand, 15, 20 years back, not really welcome. So they were not open to foreign investments. They wanted to have local partners. It was very, very difficult to get anything done there. So we started by entering India through a trading model. And we built up a huge trading business, and then slowly but surely started back integrating into manufacturing and started doing import substitution. And then Mr. Modi came. He came with this Make in India strategy, and we were ready. We did not have to plan a market entry because we had seeded the market. We knew where the customers were. We just wanted the policy support. And as soon as Mr. Modi came in, he offered the policy support and we came in with big investments into India. Today, we are successful. That company is still successful in India. Orica followed the same example. So you start early, you have a long breath, you take a little bit of risk, you slowly but surely scale the business up. And then as the tipping point on policy and strategy and government support comes through, you can scale the business up and then you get successes. Sometimes you fail, right? Because either policy doesn't keep up with you or competition comes in and they are smarter and better than you and they undercut you and then you have to fail and you have to take a hit. But that's part of the business world and you must be ready to take a little bit of risk there.
And I would assume from that response that you're someone who thinks the risk is worth it, that the outcomes on the other side is worth that outlay and that investment.
I think the risk of missing out, Lee, is so big that you do not want to not have a seat at the table in Asia.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's one thing I do really want to get to the nub of. So this, Australia sees itself as a trading nation. We love our exports. We're very good at exporting. And exporting has less risk than investing. But you've talked about both today. You've talked about investing in a market, and that can come through relationships. But I guess when I say investment, I think about physical presence, boots on the ground, some sort of local stake, and there's a lot more to navigate with that. There's a lot more stakeholders to convince on the domestic front as well with your own business. If you're the advocate for that, you're the one who's sort of suggesting, putting a stake in the ground, and we build around that. Is that do you think about different ways of that? I mean, do you think about exporting versus local presence? Is it a calculus that your business and yourself is always working through?
Yeah, look, you're always capital constrained and you cannot be everywhere at the same time. You need to set priorities. So there are quite a few markets in the world. So Orica, as an example, is active in 130 plus markets globally. We don't manufacture everything everywhere. It's just not possible, right? That would be just too capital intensive and impossible to manage. So there are different ways of going to the market, entry to the market. We do export some stuff out of Australia, but it's not very competitive because of the high costs of manufacturing here in Australia. So, what we've created is a kind of a hub and spoke model where we got regional hubs in every part of the world, and then they cater to the different countries there. So that's a model that's worked for Orica. That works for the nature of our business. It might not work for other people, but keep in mind that you always have these, tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and the trend in the world today is to protect your domestic market. So if you're not a domestic player, one way or the other, either through a distribution, through a joint venture, through a partner, through your own manufacturing, you will get tariffed out. You will get barriered out, and you will lose all the efforts and investments you've made in the market. So if you think that market is strategic and long-term for you as an investment, you should be doubling down today because the opportunity is now. But that's my view. And there is risk with that, obviously.
Absolutely. So I know the Giants Next Door alludes to the presence of all of these big markets within our region, but I can't help but then reference the US as having crystallized that tariff landscape and being acutely aware of both tariffs, the knock-on effects of those, but also you mentioned the non-tariff barriers. So there's just this mesh of aspects that businesses need to be literate about. So working through the impact of those knock-on US tariffs, I mean, that must have just, that's clearly in your world, but also it feels like geopolitics is now in the business lexicon of your average business. I mean, it's nightly news stuff. It plays out every day. And I wonder if it was always there, but this has just really brought it to the surface or made it very front and centre in terms of considerations for Australian businesses exploring international markets.
No, absolutely. I mean, the tariffs is just, I would say, the last straw on the proverbial camel's back. Because look at what we've gone through as a global economy in the last 5 years. Supply chain disruptions, a global pandemic, multiple wars in different parts of the world, geopolitics, inflation that we've not seen in decades. And then we've had the US presidency, and now we've got this constant threat of tariffs, and it's a moving target. So you don't know where you're going to land eventually. So it's on today and off tomorrow. So all of this volatility and uncertainty means that businesses have to plan, cut through the noise, look at long term. But I have to say, the big advantage of Asia has been kind of a island of peace, right? It's been geopolitically relatively stable compared to the rest of the world, compared to the Europe, compared to the Middle East and Africa and the United States. And the market is still growing. It's still very, very attractive to invest in Asia. And they are welcoming of Australian investment. So I would not be surprised if you see more and more capital start to flow into the Asian region. You see that reflected in the stock markets now. You see the Chinese economy now coming back. You see the Japanese stock markets picking up. The Indian Indian markets doing very well. The consumer demand is picking up. So you see the positives coming out there. And then if you're a global business sitting here in Australia and you have a choice, Asia kind of becomes a no-brainer. So as we speak, relatively, the Asian market becomes more attractive compared to everything else that's happening elsewhere in the world. And that's again, a very, very fantastic opportunity for Australian businesses.
But it's also tempting, like I encounter this, it's also tempting when there's a lot going on. When the world becomes even more complex, there's a tendency to want to retreat. And I think, or stay within your comfort zone. And for businesses, a lot of their advisors are telling them the same. I mean, there's a level of conservatism that comes in volatile times. But how should businesses be thinking about that in this current circumstance? I mean, how do they work out this risk-reward trade-off, which we referenced earlier?
Yeah, look at it. Most businesses operate on two tracks. One is a long-term strategy, which could be 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And then you have obviously the short-term challenges and opportunities, and you need to find a balance. And that balance can change either way, depending on what's happening globally in the environment. So, but never ever forget, and I don't think most businesses do that, always keep in mind where you're headed 5, 10, and 15 years down the line. So the investments you make today, whether it's innovation in R&D, which is again a long-term high-risk investment, you don't get any payback today. If you now stop all of your development work, within 3 or 5 years, you have nothing left to grow with. Right? So it's all about managing this to say, yeah, maybe I had ambitions of getting into 3 Asian countries. I'll pare that back and maybe go into 1 first, or go with an asset-light strategy or a capex-light strategy first. Wait for the environment to stabilize, but that doesn't change your long-term strategy, which is to grow in Asia. Right? So that's the way you always try and balance your risks and rewards and the time horizons, because you will see fluctuations, you will see volatility, but your long-term goals should not be changing. And if your long-term goal is to be successful in Asia, you'll find ways of doing this in a cautious, more capital-light kind of way, a risk-light kind of way, but then scale up when the market turns in your favor, which will always happen because business is cyclical by nature. We've known that. We see that.
Sanjeev, I'm having this image of the executive who's going to the rest of their colleagues in the business, maybe their manager, maybe their bankers, who knows who it might be, that's going there and advocating for an international expansion strategy. How does someone push the right buttons? What are the when someone comes to you, when one of your senior executives comes to you and says, look, we're looking at this market, this opportunity, this project. I mean, in terms of, is it size of the opportunity? Is it risk mitigation? Is it fear of missing out? Like, what are the levers that are really going to move the needle for people who are advocating for international expansion?
Yeah. So look, it's all of it, all of what you said and a bit more. The first question I would always ask is this within your strategic horizon? Is this within your strategic guardrails? Are you within your swim lanes? Is this something that you have planned to do and now you're coming with an execution plan and you're asking for capital? That's the first question I would ask, because you get hundreds of brilliant ideas, but they may not necessarily be part of your core strategy or might fit into your business needs or are part of your business in 5 and 10 years online. So that's the first question you ask. Is this part of your strategy and is this one of the execution plans or streams that you have? If that's a yes, then you talk about the risk rewards. You talk about what kind of opportunities are there in future to grow. What differentiates your investment from competition? Because there's always competition. There's domestic competition. There's other international players looking at the market. And if you're a late entrant, the question is, why now? Why is this the right time? So you ask a list of questions and that either convinces you, and the numbers don't lie in the end. Right? You have a business case in front of you, you challenge the business case, and if it makes sense and you break even in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th year, and it's attractive enough for future potential, you take a risk and say, okay, I'm willing to sign off on this investment. This is something I do all the time. So as an example, in the last 5 years, we have exited something like 10 to 15 jurisdictions, countries, and we've entered another 20 new ones. So managing your portfolio of markets is something that's an ongoing exercise. We have a structured process of doing this. We get sign off from our E&C teams. For example, are there ethics and compliance risks? Are there safety risks? Are there license to operate risks? What's the impact on us as an Australian listed company? Reputational risks. Then what are the opportunities? So you have a structured process, you go through that process, and then we call it a country entry process. And then if you've ticked the right boxes, you get the allowance to set up a legal entity, to invest capital, to enter into a joint venture, to an acquisition, whatever you're planning to do. So first important step is it part of your strategy? And then you look at the risks and the reward, and then you take a educated call, and you still make mistakes. Because you're betting on the future, and nobody's seen the future, right? So,
and look, and I think that's really healthy that you've brought that into the conversation around, making mistakes, getting things wrong, that's an acceptable element of, the pathway to ultimate success. I want to switch gears for a moment. People in the world of work today are very busy. CEO of Orica, I can't imagine how busy you are day to day, but since I've known you, I've always seen you as someone who's very generous with your time. You're, case in point, you're a member of the AsiaLink Business Advisory Council, an active member of our council. I also know you head up you chair the CEO and Director Network for the Centre for Australia-India Relations. But more than this, you speak at sessions, even with relatively small groups, often with, yes, an international business lens, but perhaps even Asian-Australian groups. And I really wanted to understand what you're personally hoping for through all of those engagements. I mean, why do you devote this time? Why is it so important to you? And what are you hoping to see come from it?
Well, the first obvious interest is to build credibility for Orica. I would say we are one of the most global Australian organizations with a footprint of, say, over 120, 130 jurisdictions, manufacturing in more than 35 countries all over the world. So we are one of the more global organizations in Australia. That gives us unique insights into our industry. So we are kind of a bellwether for the resource industry. We see things happening first because we are everywhere, and you can, predict trends. You can see what's happening, and then you want to share that knowledge, right, with your customers, with your suppliers, with your employees, with industry in general. So I think that's a role that Orica must play, being a global enterprise based out of Australia, and I try to do that. The other one is obviously a personal interest. I mean, I've had this experience of the privilege of having worked in multiple jurisdictions across 35 years, and I'm more than happy to share my experiences so that others on that journey need not repeat the mistakes I did. So learning from others' mistakes and obviously also from successes is a great thing to do. So whenever I have the opportunity, I'm happy to share my knowledge and my experience, and I hope that some people like today will take something useful away for their personal lives, but also for their business lives.
Amazing. So look, that prompts two questions from me, two follow-up questions. So am I correct in the sense that in terms of this level of international engagement by Orica, that are you looking to mainstream this? Are you looking for more adoption by international companies? Do you think building out that ecosystem of international engagement for more Australian businesses is beneficial to everyone?
Big time, absolutely. Look, it's important if you're an organization playing in your own field of expertise and experience that you have a seat at the table. That's very, very important, that you're part of the conversation and you're able then to influence conversations, whether this is business practices, regulations, in our case, safety. We are in a very dangerous industry, as you can imagine, and we try to lead from the front in terms of having safe practices of Australian standards in Africa or in India or in China, in emerging markets who are still catching up on the learning curve. How can we bring that international experience and this world-class standards of operations that we have had in Australia over a huge period of time, and how can we take that into young emerging jurisdictions so that they operate safely? And there's a simple logic for that. If there is an incident, an unfortunate accident in our industry, there's collateral damage to all players. So if something happens somewhere in the world in the mining industry, the entire industry gets tainted, even though we might not directly be involved there. So it's in everybody's interest in your own industry to ensure that standards, the ethical standards, the compliance standards, the safety standards are to a very, very high level. And, we try and promote that. The only way you can do that is having a seat at the table and having conversations with your European colleagues, with the American colleagues, Latin American colleagues, Asian colleagues, African colleagues all over the world. And this also means competitors, customers, suppliers. So those conversations have to be had, right? And that's the way you promote better standards and better reputation in your industry. So that's one clear direct benefit. The other one is obviously the networking, the business benefits that you get out of it. And then, innovation. I mean, there are today very smart people using AI and other technologies now to come up with new clever solutions that might benefit you, that might be a risk to you. And the only way you get to know this is by engaging with people, right? Having conversations, reaching out to people beyond your direct scope of influence. And that's something that I try and find some time to do wherever I can.
Which leads nicely to my next question, which is, do you think there's still one big mindset shift that we need to affect if we really want to realize our full potential with the region?
I mean, look, opening up the mind to the opportunities, and let's stop talking about risks. We all understand there are risks. Open up our minds to the opportunities, be committed, get your boards on your journey, get your colleagues on your journey, show small successes and build confidence over a period of time, and then leverage know-how, technology, and the Made in Australia brand. Right? So if you can just do these two things, which is a lot of work, it sounds very simple, that gives you a pretty high chance of success, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you. Sanjeev, final question from me, and perhaps summing up a lot of our conversation today. If a fellow Australian leader, a senior executive, asks you how to be more effective in the region, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
I mean, I'd start with what I started. I'd end with that. Let's say adaptability and resilience. Try and build that as much as possible. Get out there, have those conversations, learn about the Asian culture, learn about the Asian way of doing things, which is basically 17, 18 different ways of doing things there. And you will be fascinated by the opportunities there, by the emergence of aspirations within Asia to do well. And you've got some very shining examples like Japan and Korea, industrial success, powerhouses, Taiwan, small little country, Singapore, tiny country, so successful. And then you have the big mammoths like China and India. And then you have Southeast Asia in the mix. And they all have their challenges and conflicts, and we keep reading about this, but they have found a way to work together. So in my view, that is one of the most diverse part of the world, one of the most challenging, but the most rewarding where you can do business and be successful. So I would say go for it.
Sanjeev, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today, as it always is. Thank you so much for joining us on the Giants Next Door podcast.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you so much.
Take care. Thanks for tuning in to the Giants Next Door. If this conversation sparked something in you, be sure to follow the show and share it with others who are thinking seriously about Australia's future in Asia. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.